So today I'm not going to pay too much attention to chat, and I'll probably disable it later. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about singletons from the perspective of someone who's been coding for a while. I believe there are lots of opinions, what's it called? When people argue. Uh, but, oh man, I forgot. Honestly, I've used the internet for a while. Um, Flame War, that's it. So, singletons, first, I'm going to get into this article a little bit. As much as I had something I wanted to go over, I'll do that later. So, they talk about singletons and what it is, and then they say what it might be not so good at. So, let's just get straight into common uses. Okay. So, they say it's used in different design patterns: factory, abstract factory, and prototypes. That's the gang of four, along with a few other patterns. Then we go down to the anti-patterns, and this, I just wanted to lead off with this, because I'm assuming you've already been familiar with singletons, otherwise you wouldn't have clicked. So they say it cannot be inherited from. Okay, but concrete and final classes can't be inherited from either, so this isn't an anti-pattern. No control over creation. All right, this is some weird habit that new coders have where they just don't want to take responsibility. You know exactly when a singleton's getting created, and that's the first time it's called. New programming languages like Swift are literally because people are afraid of handling pointers, and honestly, you shouldn't be programming if you can't handle memory. So there's a bunch of habits on how to handle memory that old programmers had, and these were common in the game development books in the 90s, and this is because they make large systems and they learned the hard way that they need to keep track and find systems of keeping track. If you don't want to take responsibility for your own code, don't be a programmer. All right, number three, I'm going to get into depth with, and yes, I went there, and I'm going to probably cause a lot of flame wars in the comments, so I might not pay attention to the comments, assuming anybody watches this. Okay, so we'll get to the dependency injection a little bit later. But who says you need dependency injection anyway? Singleton is one of your... I consider Singleton dependency injection and frameworks to be equal, as in they do similar things. But we'll get into that next. TDD. Who says they don't allow TDD? TDD's a little... First of all, I consider TDD an anti-pattern, except for certain use cases. And TDD is great for programmer, and I know a lot. I just lost a lot of you there. TDD is great for APIs, things that the programmer can test. But as soon as you get to things that the user uses, programmers usually don't think of what the user is going to do, especially for UI. All right. So as there is no control over creation, from Wikipedia, a clean instance of the object cannot be used for each test. Well, that kind of matches point number 2 above it, with no control over creation. And once again, this depends on the programmer. In TDD, the tests, they run kind of in instances by themselves. Because of this, every time it runs, it will be a clean instance. If you forget to clean up your database or other connections, that's not the singleton's fault. Without a dependency injection mock, objects cannot be used in tests. How bad of a programmer do you have to be to not be able to put an object somewhere because it's created slightly different than another object? That said, dependency injection usually is just one object too. If you use something like Dagger for Android, and this, we're going to get into the other subjects now. So dependency injection, let's compare it. Dependency injection is when you usually have a tree of objects, and that tree of objects, I call it a tree because it gets injected into your super controller, and then it gets injected into the controllers below it. Whereas a singleton kind of exists from the moment it's created, and you can change it, and if you do change it, it just exists from that moment forward for the next one. A dependency injection is slightly different. The tree gets injected, so a super controller, or the main window, you could say, could hold you could say a credit card machine, and your little credit card dependency um, it's always on the main controller. But then a subcontroller, you either have to put it there or you can inject a new one. There's nothing specific stating that it's all the same or that you can't or can change it. And since these anti-patterns seem to be very insistent upon changing it, well, you should be able to put a mock one below it, even though the real one's above it. I don't see why you'd do that unless you're already testing it. But dependency injection is also an interesting thing because my old boss said, and he's been coding for a much longer time than me, that you have the code in front of you. Therefore, why would you use dependencies? Dependency injection was created for software to use plugins, mostly at runtime. And I can name an example of when this happens. Java Enterprise. It does this using Hibernate and Spring. And I believe Spring is one of the most beautiful examples of object-oriented being used in one of the most elegant ways that I've ever seen. And as much as I don't like the uses of React, I believe reactive languages, they're also architecture. The React itself, I don't like apps created with React because it forces you to make everything one specific way and it takes away your thinking about architecture. And when you do think about architecture, you're going to have a React app and you're going to have your own separate, and why would you do that? So yeah, Spring in Java is a great example of dependency injection being used right, and I believe Android Dagger is a great example of dependency injection being used wrong, because why not use a singleton at that point? Which brings me to my next point, frameworks. So singletons and dependency injections are both code, and dependency injections especially are code made for the app at hand, and this is often what gives singletons flack. But what people don't think about is the use case of a singleton versus what's usually used at a large enterprise as a framework, which is basically a precompiled library that some team manages. The only difference between that and a singleton, if they do the same functions, is that you kind of need a team that separately works on that library. So I would say singletons are great for small teams, small amounts of people with small apps that you should probably still find a way to store it in the same repository so that you don't have like 5 separate audio managers or 5 separate network handlers. You should have one network handler, and if you're just a small person making applications, and I mean like one person, small, not actual height, a singleton prevents the need to deal with frameworks and you still get the same benefit. But once you get into a large team, a framework is just a precompiled, I don't want to say singleton because it can be anything, but chances are you're only going to have one in your app. And if you use dependency injection, you're going to use one and you're going to put it everywhere because that's what people do with dependency injection. So try to tell me the difference between a singleton and a DI pattern if you're just going to create one object and pass it down everywhere. When basically there is no difference for anyone that hasn't caught the rhetoric there. Some of us do. Some of us, our social skills are that of programmers. For anyone still watching, there will be arguments in the comments most likely, and you're free to argue with me. We're nerds. We get heated. Remember not to take anything personal from me or each other. Okay. So I talked about TDD. I also said it's kind of an anti-pattern, and I like the philosophy behind TDD, but I just want to make it clear, like TDD, and this is something that my boss, he also got into, the Gang of Four patterns and test-driven development, they're guidelines. They're not meant to be taken as like word of law. People like to do that because when you believe dependency injection or singletons or exceptions, which is a separate video eventually, is one way, then you can put responsibility on the person. But we're problem solvers. The job of being an engineer is to think about how to put things together. It's not to do it the exact same way. So what I tried to do here is give you a way of stopping and thinking about what are singletons for? How do you use the use case? What is your use case as a programmer? How many apps are they, or applications are you going to put your networking code in? Is a singleton better for that? Did your team get really large? Okay, singleton's not useful anymore. Switch it